Hello, class. This is my first experiment at making a recording, um, so bear with me. Let me just go over what we're doing so far. This week, I want to do chapters 8 and 9, finish out the book. So that would mean today, for Monday, I'll give you chapter 8. For Tuesday, we'll go over chapter 9. Wednesday, I'll give you the research documents that you can choose from. And I'll also include a document that will allow you to write like some thesis statement, make a general idea of what it is you're going to be talking about. I know some people like Anna has already figured out where she's focused on. So basically, I've broken the research down into three sections. One is prohibition, because I want you to say something about Gatsby, where this whole thing with prohibition came from. And remember, prohibition was started to make the country better because alcohol is a bad thing. It's bad for you. And then that fell apart because of the criminal element. And then we moved, the second phase was really during the 70s when Richard Nixon announced his war on drugs. And he was specifically trying to get the liberals and the blacks. That's what he said. That's a quote. That's exactly what he said. And I'm going to give you that piece of information. And then what happened was the drug laws basically became a method of locking up black and brown people in America, which is what it has become today. And this is kind of where Anna is focused. So that's fine. You know, just as long as you start with Gatsby to talk about how Gatsby is a novel about this great experiment. That's what they called it, prohibition, this great experiment. And it worked so horribly that they decided to make it work against all the black and brown people in America. That's what it is today. That's why our prisons are filled with all sorts of people on simple little charges. All right. But anyway, going over chapter 8, we went through the climax of the novel the other day, and now we're on chapter 8. The Do Now asked you, how does Daisy say goodbye to Gatsby? Well, she just comes and stands in the window and looks out at him for a minute and then goes to bed. That's goodbye. Sweet, isn't it? You want to take a moment, wipe the tears away? I know, it's very sad, very touching. But today, what we're going to look at in chapter 8, we really need to look at Gatsby and, what is kind of the problem here? Because there's a problem here. After that, Nick goes to visit Gatsby, and Gatsby begins to tell him the story of how he met Daisy. So I'm just going to kind of go through the questions that I asked you and kind of go over my thinking and why I asked those questions. They have this great line where Nick tells us that Jay Gatsby had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice. That's on page 148. And that's when he begins to talk about Daisy. And when he talks about her, he talks about her because he kind of wants to get away from the unpleasant reality of what's going on. So he retreats into his fantasies, which is okay. I mean, you can do that. That's certainly one thing to do when things are not going well. You can just escape into your fantasy world. Some of us escape into books, some of us escape into video games, some of us have other things that we escape into. That's what we do. That's a normal thing. So he goes into his memories of Daisy, and he talks about how he met her, and there was this ripe mystery about her. He also says she was the first nice girl he had ever met. I'm not really sure what that means, but it is certainly implied that Gatsby, as Jay Gantz, had a lot of girlfriends before he finally meets Daisy. But the other thing about Daisy that gets to him is that it excites him that many men had loved Daisy. So essentially, Nick is telling us that Gatsby understood that Daisy had had many lovers, and that increased her value to him, which is kind of an unusual way to look at a human being in terms of value. But I think it's an important point, and I think we should keep it in mind when we think about Gatsby, because there is something about him that is very much like Tom. You know, Daisy is kind of a possession, and when she doesn't behave that way, he kind of loses it. He doesn't know what to say. But they say on page 149, he took what he could get ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually, he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. Now, I think we're all old enough to understand that when Nick tells us that he took Daisy, um, he's not talking about taking her for a walk in the park. And then later, so I think we all kind of understand what that means. But later it says, he might have despised himself, which kind of would have been a very normal reaction to think, gosh, I kind of deceived this sweet girl, and now I've possibly got her into a pregnancy situation. But no, he says that he had taken her under false pretenses, and that's one of the questions that I ask you. How does he misrepresent himself to Daisy? He misrepresents himself by trying to make it appear that he's from her social class, which he most certainly is not. And so Daisy becomes, on page 148, it becomes the following of a grail. A grail is the symbol from Christianity. It represents the chalice that Christ used at the Last Supper. And it's supposed to represent kind of the essence of the religious experience. So Daisy has become kind of a grail for Gatsby. It's a quest. It's something that he has to discover. But Nick isn't telling us the classic hero's journey. If you guys don't know this, or if you never got it before, because you should have at this point, the hero's journey is really pretty simple. You take somebody that's just kind of a plain old ordinary guy, say like you or I, although it's almost always a guy. Now we're beginning to see that it could actually be a female. Anyway, they go on this journey. When they're on the journey, they meet a mentor, and the mentor tells them, the wise old things. Be careful with your power, don't use it gratuitously, don't harm anybody, all that stuff. That kind of changed with The Matrix, because you notice, if any of you ever watched that film, The Matrix, Neo's mentor is the guy called Orpheus, and Orpheus tells him at one point that anybody in here could be a bad guy. He doesn't tell him the other side, that anybody in here could also be you, Nick. That would be, are you Neo? That would be the classical mentor's role, to remind the hero of his power and the danger in just using it indiscriminately. They didn't do that in The Matrix. Kind of a change. It's a big departure. But anyway, the hero continues on his journey, and as he's doing that, he really becomes proficient with his power. Then he's able to go off and save the world, which he almost invariably always does, or we don't get to hear about him. And in that journey, he, of course, meets a beautiful girl, and he marries her, and that's it. That's kind of what happens. So for Gatsby, his grail has become Daisy. and his superpower is money, which is appropriate in America because the only thing that really matters is how much money you have in America. It doesn't matter what you've done, it doesn't matter the good things that you try to do, it doesn't matter, the love or happiness that you give or bring. All that matters is how much money you have. And some of you are really starting to hit on that in your commentary, which is really, really good. Right after this all happens, he's kind of surprised to find out that he loved her. That's what he says. I can't describe to you how surprised I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her, old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't, because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute, and all of a sudden I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I could have a better time telling her what I was going to do? So Gatsby's Grail becomes conquering Daisy and achieving that great accomplishment. That's what he thinks is the greatest accomplishment of all time. And so it does seem to be clear that Daisy loves him as well. And she kind of hangs around with him. But the next question I ask you is, how do they fall apart? Well, they fall apart after the war because Gatsby's stuck in Oxford receiving this honorary degree, and Daisy just kind of gets bored. She writes to him, tells him, come on, you have to come home. He can't, for whatever reason, break away from this obligation that he has through the military. Um, and then she meets Tom Buchanan, and he comes in and he steals her away. Um, Nick has an interesting quote on page 151 where they talk about these casual things, the chiffon of an evening dress, tangled among dying orchards on the floor beside her bed. I'm sorry, I lost that thought. I shouldn't have brought that up. So I'm going to skip that. I'll come back to that if I can ever remember what the hell I said about that. The only thing I guess I really thought about that was that it's really interesting when you actually do get into a serious relationship. It's very interesting the things that you remember about people. They're casual, incidental things. Sometimes they just don't seem to make any sense. And I guess that's why that attracted me. I wanted to kind of point that out. But anyway, at the bottom of page 151, Daisy meets Tom Buchanan, and she goes off with him. And that's kind of the end about it. And then Nick says his famous goodbye to Gatsby. You're better than all the rest of them. What he says is, they're a rotten crowd. I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch of them put together. And then he says, I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. And then he goes off. And that's the last time he sees Gatsby. But remember, Nick disapproves of everybody. As somebody pointed out really well last week, Nick is the kind of old-fashioned Midwestern American value. He's down on all these guys. He's got something bad to say about everybody, except, of course, himself. Because notice in the interim, he just kind of dumps Jordan. For no particular reason. He just dumps her. All he says is that we were talking and I wasn't really listening, and I don't even know who hung up first. And I didn't care, which is Okay, kind of rough, actually. He's been seeing her for a while, and he just lets her kind of go. And I think this is very revealing about Nick more than anything else. But then we get to the part about George Wilson, and George has a way of figuring it out. But before we get there, on page 159, George talks about how I told her she might fool me, but she can't fool God. She couldn't fool God. I took her to the window, and he points up, and he's pointing up to the sign of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. That's why when you were introduced to that sign in chapter 2, I said, these are the eyes of God, because this is what God has become. The idea that there's a moral value, that there is an absolute right or wrong, has gone away. Since God is no longer here, God in our world has been reduced to an advertisement on a billboard. And Nick is very much saying there's something wrong with it. And I agree. And I think most people do agree with it. And I'm not trying to push religion. I'm just saying there is an absolute right or wrong. There are things that are right, there are things that are wrong. But in this novel, and one of Nick's complaints is that we don't seem to have any sense of what those things are. All right? And that's that last question. Who sees Myrtle's sins? So what we have to really think about in this chapter is we have to really think about what kind of person is Gatsby? What the heck is wrong with him? I mean, let's be honest. He is kind of admirable in his desire to love Daisy. We can't really hate someone like that. Perhaps he did commit some crimes, but we do live in a society where the only way you can achieve that kind of wealth is not the only way, but it's certainly one of the ways that you can achieve that kind of wealth through crime, through criminality. And that's kind of what Prohibition gave us. But also he's incredibly sentimental and he's incredibly childish. And I'm not really sure he loves the person because Daisy is a human being. She's not an object. Gatsby is still guilty of one of the things a lot of men are guilty of. They view women as objects. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of women who view men as objects as well. I mean, look at the long list of objects J-Lo has accumulated in her lifetime. You know, it kind of does go both ways. But generally speaking, it's more something that men have pursued. Men have pursued women as objects. Our current president has this object as a wife. I don't think she can speak more than a few words. She's not there to speak. She's there because she looks good. That's it. And unfortunately, that's something that we do have to keep in mind about Gatsby. He's not only kind of typical, a typical American male, he's also extremely childish and extremely naive. And he never really wakes up to the fact that Daisy is Daisy. She is not something that he has dreamed about. She is a human being, and he never comes to terms with that. So when she comes and says goodbye to him, it's very appropriate for her. She's saying goodbye. That's it. It's over. Sorry, Jay. Better luck next time. She has moved on. But Jay doesn't get it. And so at the end of the chapter, when George Wilson shows up and throws that bullet into him, and Gatsby drops into the water, the small circle of blood floating up to the surface. That's the end of Gatsby. And for Fitzgerald, I believe there was nothing else. he could have done. He did all he could to get her. It didn't work. His life is over because he does not understand anything else. So I want you to think about that. Hopefully this helped. Hopefully I can upload it. Take care.